This is part 4 of the Team Associated B5M Factory Lite build series. So I have completed the gearbox and mounted it, and that basically gets you through part bag D and E and F. And then after that you get to the rear hubs and the CVAs. So the assembly here is relatively straightforward. There were no snags or anything. One thing to point out is that the 5x8mm bearings here that you use for the diff are not in parts bag D, they're in parts bag A. So in one of the previous videos I pointed out that there were 2 extra bearings that you get in the kit and I wasn't sure where they went. Well, this is where they go. Why they did not put those bearings in parts bag D where it belongs with the diff build, I don't know. But nevertheless, if you see those 2 extra bearings in parts bag A, they go to the diff. The diff builds like any associated diff, so there's really nothing new to go over there. As part of the Factory Lite series, what they do offer you is an aluminum lightweight top shaft, which is nice. And all of the bearings that you get, with the exception of the diff bearing, all the rest of the drivetrain bearings have a rubber seal on one side and a metal shield on the other side. So when you build the gearbox, for example, you want to insert the bearings in a way so that the blue rubber shield faces outwards. So from the case looking in, the blue rubber shields would be facing out this way. And likewise for this side, blue rubber shields would be facing out this way. The manual doesn't tell you explicitly to do that, but it's a good idea because the dirt is going to come in from this side into the diffs, and then on the side where the input shaft comes out, dirt can get in there potentially. Okay, so you want to make sure the shields are facing outwards. And of course you would do the same for the front steering knuckles as well, both at the outside and at the inside. Sorry, bad lighting here. See, blue on the outside and blue on the outside. So again, manual doesn't tell you to do that, but common sense would say so. Otherwise, if the metal shield is facing outwards, then dirt can get in through the metal shield, which doesn't act as a very good shield, and the bearings will gum up more quickly. So that's just a little note there. Gearbox goes together like a normal gearbox. It takes 5 screws to screw together the gearbox, another 3 screws to put on the motor plate. So this is part of how the 5th generation of B5s is assembled for the gearbox, which in some ways is nice because it allows you to disassemble the gearbox halves without the motor plate dropping off. And all of the other RC10s through the original all the way up to the 4th generation, the motor plate, the motor mount plate, was part of the assembly that you use to screw the gearbox together. So when you pull these screws out, the motor plate pops off. You get used to it. It's not a big deal. But I guess for some people, they found it frustrating enough that they want to have these as 2 separate things. Okay, fine. Technically, that adds weight. So if you're genuinely looking to build an actual lightweight chassis, which is the claim here for a stock car chassis, you'd want to remove as many screws as possible. So, not that they would or should necessarily redesign an entire gearbox just for stock motors, but if they're really looking to optimize this, they'd remove these 3 screws and set it up so that this motor plate screws on as part of the gearbox assembly for one of these 5 screws. That would reduce weight. It would be, a little more to handle when you're assembling it, but it would reduce weight. And you would also maybe not use 5 screws to put the gearbox together, maybe 4 screws. Do you really need 5 screws to hold it all together? I'm not entirely sure of that. But it is what it is. One thing that was kind of interesting is the slipper clutch that you get is the old style slipper clutch. It's not the VTS slipper with the dual plate, dual pad slipper on the outside. It's the old school standard octagonal slipper pads on both the inside and outside with your slipper plates and your spur gear. And I would assume that they did this to save weight. I'm not sure what to think because, okay, the slipper pads themselves are not the high torque slipper pads, which are slightly thicker versions of these. These are just the standard pads, which you could argue, well, this is a stock motor, so you don't need the high torque pads. Fine. And then on the outside here, on the one hand, the slipper plate on the outside here is metal. I guess it's aluminum. That's this bit right here. So that's heavier than the plastic unit you would have otherwise used on the VTS slipper. So you're gaining weight with this metal piece. But on the other hand, the VTS slipper has a metal ring on the inside that slots between the two outer slipper pads. I think it's actually 2 metal rings. So it's possible that those 2 metal rings weigh more combined than this slipper pad here. I haven't done an exact weight comparison, but I would actually probably expect this plate here to weigh more, just because I think it's made of more material. So if you're trying to save rotational mass, you'd actually probably want to go to a VTS slipper instead of the standard slipper. So I'm not exactly sure why they did this. It doesn't really make sense. Again, if the goal here is to reduce rotational mass, why they would include this, I'm not entirely sure. But a slipper is a slipper. You know, as far as adjustability goes, some claim that the VTS gives you slip adjustability over a wider torque range, while other people claim that the standard slipper assembly like this here is actually more consistent over a single race, that it doesn't heat up in the same way as a VTS would, and so from the beginning of the race to the end of the race, the way the slipper behaves is more predictable. I haven't really noticed too big a difference either way. I use both types of slippers in different cars. But anyway, that's just something worth noting. And to mount the gearbox does require quite a few screws, because for this gearbox, you have the gearbox itself, plus this front shield here. I guess you can call it a motor shield, because the motor mounts in here. So you mount this assembly, and you have 2 screws connecting the shield to the gearbox, and 2 screws back here connecting the gearbox to the rear shock tower. So it's 4 screws, plus 2 screws coming through the bottom of the chassis connecting the shield to the chassis. So that's 6 screws, plus another 4 screws, connecting the gearbox to the chassis, these 4 here. So now we're up to 10 screws, right? So it's 4, 6, 8, 10, plus 5 screws to close the gearbox. That's 15, plus 3 screws for the motor plate. So that's 18 screws in total to mount the gearbox. And if you're trying to save weight, you could actually design this a little bit differently. You could, for example, design this shield to be part of the gearbox assembly so that it comes in halves. So that would save you these 2 screws here. Okay. And then you could, again, use fewer screws for the gearbox, and you could have those long enough to mount through to this motor plate. So you could probably save 2, 3, 4, 5 screws worth of weight if you really did this right. But that's just me being nitpicky. If I were to do it, that's probably how I would do it to really, save weight. Okay, so I would imagine that servicing the diff would be challenging then, because if you want to get the gearbox out, you have to take out 4 screws at the bottom. And then you probably don't have to take out these 2 screws, but you could take these 2 out and these 2 out. So that's 8 plus these 5. So that's 13 screws to get to the diff. I think on the B5 rear motor, you have 2, 4, 6 to get the gearbox out, and then another 5 to take the gearbox apart. So that's a total of 11. So you have to take 2 more screws out of this than you would out of the rear motor B5 to get to the differential. Okay. So just a thought. All right. Enough complaining there. So gearbox is done. Basically, it comes down to finishing the drivetrain with the CVAs, the rear hub carriers. Then after that, we get to the turnbuckles and the shocks, and that's it. Then we get to the electronics, and that's basically the end of the build. So I'll make a video probably after either after the CVAs are done or after turnbuckles. I don't know. In the meantime, thanks for watching.